Not all silences are peaceful, some are just empty. 12 years. That's how long it had been since Margaret Ellison last heard a cello string hum, or the wind rattle the oak trees outside the west window of the conservatory. 12 years since the world, so alive with music and laughter and rustling linens, had dimmed to stillness. Not peace, just absence. She used to believe silence could be meditative, even sacred, but this wasn't that. This was silence with teeth, the kind that nipped at her ankles during the long evenings and made even the crackling of the fireplace feel imaginary. The doctors called it an acoustic neuroma, a benign tumor on the nerve that connected her ear to her brain. It wasn't life-threatening, but it took her hearing like a thief in the night. One morning, she'd simply woken up to a world no longer in stereo, and by the end of that year, nothing at all. Her home in Charleston had once thrummed with energy. The Ellison family estate, a proud Georgian with carved mahogany banisters, had been a gathering place. Quartet rehearsals in the music room, charity galas in the parlor, William's voice calling out for brandy from the library. Now, all of that lived only in memory. The grand piano still stood in the back room, but its keys hadn't been touched in a decade. Dust didn't gather. Helena wouldn't allow it. But the absence of fingerprints was louder than the dust would have been. Margaret had adjusted in her own way. She read lips, kept a notepad on hand, and learned to navigate the world by its rhythms instead of its tones. What she couldn't hear, she memorized. The footfalls of Helena in the hallway. The vibration of the oven timer against the marble counter. The slow sigh of her son Peter when he visited out of obligation rather than affection. Peter still looked the part of a doting son. Clean-shaven, cufflinks always matching his belt buckle, his speech slow and careful when speaking to her, as though enunciating for a tourist who didn't speak the local language. But behind his practiced smile was a distance she hadn't felt when he was younger. A coolness, not sharp but unmistakable. Then there was Erica. Erica Ellison, née Caldwell, never missed a chance to treat Margaret like she was made of fine china. Her greetings were always a little too bright, her compliments a little too rehearsed. "You look lovely, Margaret. That scarf brings out your eyes," she'd say, placing air kisses on cheeks she didn't really see. When she thought Margaret wasn't looking, her gaze would wander to the antique silver, the grandfather clock, the oil painting of Margaret's mother in the main hallway. Erica came less for conversation and more for inventory. Margaret had noticed the way Erica touched things that didn't belong to her, lightly, as though rehearsing for a future where they did. She would comment on how difficult these old homes must be to maintain, and how perhaps a smaller space would be more manageable for someone at this stage of life. Margaret would smile, nod, and write, "Thank you for your concern," on her notepad. They never said it aloud, but she felt it. They were waiting her out. She didn't blame them entirely. Grief and time do strange things to people. William's passing had left a vacuum, and into that vacuum had slipped ambition, inheritance questions, and too many politely veiled suggestions that maybe the family estate should go to someone who could make better use of it. But Margaret wasn't gone. Not yet. And silence, she had learned, wasn't just a condition. It could also be a strategy. Because beneath the hush of her quiet house, beneath the polished routines and porcelain smiles, Margaret was still listening, not with her ears, not yet, but with every inch of her intuition. And soon she'd have more than intuition. Soon she'd have sound again, and with it, the truth. The envelope arrived tucked between a furniture catalog and a property tax notice, unremarkable at first glance, but the return address stopped Margaret's hands mid-sort. Johns Hopkins Auditory Institute. Her fingertips brushed the embossed seal. The paper was thick, important. She already knew what it was before she opened it. Approval. She'd spent 6 months undergoing scans, assessments, evaluations that poked at every edge of her memory and nerve function. And now it seemed she'd been accepted into their neural implant trial. Experimental, yes, but promising. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the envelope resting on the lace tablecloth like it might shatter if touched again. Helena was out picking up fresh tulips for the hallway vase. The house was still, the kind of still that begged for interruption. She didn't open the letter right away. She just stared at it, tracing the neat handwriting of her name, Mrs. Margaret Ellison. No widow, no senior, just her. That felt rare these days. When she finally unfolded the contents, her hands moved slowly. Dear Mrs. Ellison, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected for Phase 2 of the Auditory Reintegration Study. Your initial response metrics indicate a strong candidacy for full or partial auditory restoration through neural implant technology. The words blurred for a moment. Not from tears exactly, just gravity. The appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Early morning, Baltimore. A driver would be arranged, everything covered. All she had to do was say yes. She folded the letter, pressed it flat, and slid it into the middle drawer beneath her handwritten recipes and a few forgotten birthday cards. Then she walked to the sink and poured herself a glass of water she didn't drink. She didn't tell Peter. She certainly didn't tell Erica. The last time Erica had spoken about Margaret's condition, she'd used words like limitation, decline, and eventual transition. Margaret had sat on the other side of the room, pretending to be absorbed in a crossword puzzle, while her daughter-in-law discussed her future like a business acquisition. She could still picture Erica leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, tapping her perfect nails against her sleeve like a metronome of measured disdain. Number Erica didn't deserve to know, not yet. That evening, after Helena returned and set the tulips in a ceramic vase shaped like a swan, Margaret waited until the tea kettle hissed before motioning her over. She signed slowly, clearly. I've been accepted. Helena's eyebrows lifted. The implant study? Margaret nodded. Helena sat beside her, the steam from the kettle curling between them. You're doing it? She asked softly. Margaret signed again. Next Tuesday. Helena's hand moved to her chest. Oh, Margaret, that's a miracle. Margaret held up one finger. No one else knows. Promise me. There was no hesitation. Helena nodded, eyes misting. You have my word. They sat in silence for a while, one real, one practiced, until the kettle whistled again. Helena rose to pour the tea. Margaret watched her movements, steady and familiar, and felt a quiet strength form behind her ribs. She wasn't nervous about the procedure. Not really. She was nervous about what she might hear when it was over. She had lived in silence long enough to know that sound wasn't always kind, but she was ready. I want to know what they say when they think I'm still in the dark, she signed into the space between them. Helena nodded. And when you do? Margaret's expression didn't change. Then we'll decide what's next. They arrived in a flurry of leather and perfume. The Ellisons, dressed like they were stopping by between donor galas and wine tastings. Peter's knock was always too soft, as if he resented announcing himself. Erica's perfume, on the other hand, arrived 3 seconds before she did. Something sharp and floral that didn't match the weather. Margaret stood by the front window, notebook in hand, watching Helena open the door with her usual polite warmth. Mother, Peter said, his voice crisp, his tie perfectly knotted. You look well. Margaret offered a small smile and nodded, lifting her notepad. Thank you. Come in. Erica followed close behind, removing her sunglasses with a dramatic flourish and scanning the foyer like a seasoned real estate agent. This place, she said with faux reverence, it always smells like memory. Then under her breath, to no one in particular, or dust. They walked through the front hallway, Margaret trailing slightly behind. She let them look. That was what they were here for anyway. In the sitting room, Erica paused at the display cabinet and tilted her head at the sterling silver tea service. Her fingers hovered over the handle of the sugar bowl, then retreated just before making contact. Margaret took her seat by the fireplace. She preferred that chair. Low arms, deep cushion, good posture for pretending not to notice things. Helena brought tea, as she always did. Earl Grey for Peter, hibiscus for Erica, peppermint for Margaret. Each cup placed with precision, each saucer clinking just so. Peter barely touched his. Erica sipped hers like she was on camera. "This house," Erica said, crossing her legs with elegance too practiced to be casual, "must be so much to keep up. All these old beams and pipes. They don't make things like this anymore," which is both a compliment and a warning, I suppose. Peter nodded, glancing at his watch. Twice. Margaret wrote slowly on her notepad. "It stood over 100 years. I think it knows how to take care of itself." Erica chuckled politely, the kind of laugh one uses when ignoring a point. Of course. Still, I just wonder, have you ever considered something a little more manageable? A condo downtown, maybe? No stairs, no drafty corners. And imagine, no property taxes." Peter looked up, finally registering the conversation. "Erica," he said softly. A warning, or maybe just fatigue, but she pressed on. "I just mean, think of the freedom. You could travel. Focus on your health. We take care of everything here. The paperwork, the listings, the sorting. You wouldn't have to lift a finger." Margaret tapped her pen once against the page, then scribbled, "It's a generous thought. I'll keep it in mind." She held up the page with a calm smile, the kind she'd learned from decades of board meetings and scholarship auditions. Smile without agreeing, nod without conceding. Erica returned the smile, thin and professional, but her eyes moved again, to the oil painting in the hallway, the walnut grandfather clock that had been in the family since 1903, the Tiffany lamp Margaret had won at a silent auction the year before William died. They weren't visiting. They were previewing. Peter stood. "We should head out soon. We have that dinner at the Grove." "Of course," Erica said, brushing invisible lint from her lap. She leaned down and kissed Margaret's cheek. Cold air, no contact. "You look lovely, Margaret," she said sweetly. Then quieter, "Don't forget to rest." Margaret walked them to the door, waving as the car pulled out of the long circular driveway. She didn't write anything after they left. She didn't need to. The hospital room was the color of rain clouds. Pale blue walls, soft gray light, and a sterile silence Margaret knew too well. She lay still, eyes closed, arms tucked neatly beneath a thin blanket. The air was cold, but her hands weren't shaking. She hadn't told Peter about the surgery, or Erica. Especially not Erica. Only Helena had known. Helena, who had packed her weekender bag with silent care, who'd arranged the driver from Charleston to Baltimore like she was planning a discreet vacation. Helena, who'd squeezed her hand once, firmly, before the nurse had wheeled her away. Margaret remembered very little of the procedure itself. Just the mask, the scent of antiseptic, a soft voice telling her to count backward from 10, then nothing, then everything. The first thing she heard was the beeping of a monitor, then her own heartbeat, strong, present, astonishing, then the distant hum of fluorescent lights, then a voice. "Mrs. Ellison, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open. The world looked the same, but it sounded different. The voice belonged to Dr. Zayden, the head of the auditory reintegration team. He was tall, soft-spoken, and had eyes that smiled before his mouth did. Margaret blinked twice and then slowly nodded. Her throat was dry, but the words were already waiting. "Yes," she whispered. "I can hear you." The sound of her own voice startled her. It was thinner than she remembered, fragile, as if it had been kept in storage and needed airing out. But it was hers. And it worked. Dr. Zayden beamed. "Most patients take a few days before any sound recognition. This is remarkable." He said more. Something about temporary swelling, gradual adaptation, noise thresholds. But she barely registered it. She was too busy listening. The swish of curtains being drawn, the rattle of a tray, the footsteps of nurses in the hallway, the click of a pen, the distant hum of a vending machine. She hadn't realized how many sounds a world could carry. When Helena arrived that afternoon, She was holding a bouquet of freesias and 2 books from Margaret's favorite mystery series. She paused just inside the door, tentative. Margaret turned to her and smiled. Then she said softly but clearly, "They work." Helena's hands flew to her mouth and the freesias tumbled slightly to the side. "Oh, my lord," she whispered, eyes welling. "Oh, Margaret," Margaret nodded, already blinking tears back. "I'm here, all the way." They didn't talk much after that, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't need to. Helena stayed until visiting hours ended. Margaret kept the hearing aids on low, letting the world trickle in instead of rush. That night, lying awake in her hospital bed, Margaret stared at the ceiling tiles. She wasn't thinking about music. She wasn't thinking about the piano in the back room or the cello William used to play. She was thinking about people, voices, words said behind closed doors, truths no one thought she could hear. She would go home soon, and when she did, nothing would change, not on the surface. She would still carry her notepad. She would still nod politely. But now she wouldn't just be observing, she would be listening. And Helena, her oldest ally, would be the only one who knew. In silence, they would wait. And in silence, they would gather the truth. It was a Tuesday. Clear skies, quiet air, and just enough breeze to stir the hydrangeas along the front walk. Helena had gone to the market for lemons and fresh parsley, and Margaret had settled in the sunroom with a blanket over her lap and a book she wasn't actually reading. She heard the tires on the gravel before the doorbell rang. Erica, unannounced. Margaret glanced at the antique clock above the piano. 11:42 a.m. Too early for social, too late for politeness. She pressed her hearing aids just enough to tune the volume low. She didn't want to hear the city outside. She wanted to hear this house. The front door creaked open. Helena had left it unlocked for the gardener. "Margaret?" Erica's voice floated in, syrupy and sweet. "I just had a few minutes between meetings. Thought I'd check in." Margaret didn't move. She stayed curled in the armchair, still and quiet, gazing out the window like she hadn't heard a thing. Erica walked into the sunroom, her heels clicking softly on the wood floor. "Oh," she said, her voice louder now. "I see you're resting. I won't stay long." Margaret turned her head slowly and offered a soft smile. Nothing more. She didn't reach for her notepad, just watched. Erica walked past her, circling the room like she was inspecting it for resale. Her fingers grazed the edge of a sideboard, the rim of a crystal vase, the frame of a black and white photo of William in his tuxedo. Margaret lowered her eyes. The photo stayed upright. Then Erica's phone buzzed. She answered it without hesitation, standing 5 feet away, facing the French doors, speaking plainly. "Yes, I'm here now," she said. "No, Peter couldn't come. Board meeting ran over. It's just me." A pause. Then laughter. "She hasn't moved. Just staring out the window in that same old robe. Honestly, she's like a painting now. Still elegant, but irrelevant." Margaret's fingers twitched under the blanket. Her face remained still. "She hasn't written anything," Erica continued. "No notepad. Just nods like she's barely following. I think Peter's right. She's not well. It's just a matter of time before the estate transitions." There was another pause, and then clearer this time. "She's basically just a signature in pearls." Margaret's breath caught, not in anger, not in shock, in recognition. There it is, she thought. The real voice. Erica laughed softly. No, not yet. Peter says we wait a few months more. Let her think we're just helping. That way she won't resist when it's time to simplify. Honestly, I'm doing her a favor." Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, just enough to let the light catch the edge of her teacup. Erica turned, startled. "Oh," she said again. "I didn't realize you were—" She cleared her throat. "Awake." Margaret blinked slowly and smiled, the corners of her mouth calm and composed. Erica walked toward her, tucking her phone away. "Just chatting with Peter. We're so glad you're comfortable here, truly." Margaret gave a slow nod, still not reaching for the notepad. Erica hesitated. For a second, something flickered. Unease, perhaps. But it passed quickly. "Well," she said, brushing invisible lint from her sleeve. I should go. Just wanted to say hello. She kissed the air near Margaret's cheek, then left the room with the same gentle click of heels. The front door closed. Margaret sat alone again, the silence now full of sound. Her pulse was steady. Her plan was forming. She had heard enough. The folder wasn't thick, just a slim bundle of envelopes tucked inside a plain manila sleeve. But Helena set it down like it weighed something. Margaret looked up from the breakfast table, where a half-sliced peach and a linen napkin sat untouched. Helena didn't speak. She just opened the folder and spread the pages carefully, smoothing the edges with the same precision she used when making beds or folding scarves. Margaret adjusted her hearing aids. Is that from the bank? Helena nodded, her mouth a line drawn tight with restraint. It came yesterday. I signed for it. Figured it was best if you saw it first. Margaret pulled the folder closer. The header was familiar. Charleston Heritage Federal. She'd kept her accounts there for decades. The same branch manager, the same trust advisor. It was where William had set up the estate accounts, the legacy funds, and the living expenses. Everything had been structured, steady, clean. She flipped through the pages slowly. Dates, transactions, balances. Her eyes scanned the columns. There were the usual entries: monthly utilities, household wages, insurance premiums. And then there were others: $18,600, roof maintenance, artisan group; $12,400, interior resurfacing, advance restorations; $9,200, landscape planning, prestige yards. Margaret's hand froze over the third line. She looked at Helena. Do those names mean anything to you? Helena shook her head. No one's been here, not in months, not even the plumber. Margaret sat back, her mind suddenly alive with cold calculation. Advance restorations, she murmured. That's not even a real contractor, is it? Helena hesitated. I called the number listed in the memo line. It goes to a voicemail with no business name. And I checked the garden ledger. No new design work. Nothing billed to the estate in my files. Margaret traced the edge of the statement with her finger. Not with anger, with precision. I used to teach my students that dissonance in music wasn't a mistake. It was a sign something unresolved was asking to be noticed. Helena folded her arms. These aren't mistakes. Number they weren't. Margaret turned to the second page. More entries, more clever labels. Accessibility upgrades. Household efficiency review. Consulting. Long-term downsizing strategy. All just polite ways of saying, we took what we thought you'd never notice. They called it help, she said quietly. The bank called it withdrawal. Helena reached for the third page. Here, look at the signature. Margaret leaned in. Her own name, or rather a version of it, scrawled in pen, but not her handwriting. Not even close. She didn't feel heat rise in her cheeks. She felt something cooler, focused. Peter had access to the accounts. Erica knew the language to dress theft in soft linens. And Margaret had let them, thinking silence gave her dignity. But silence, she was learning, also gave others room to steal. She closed the folder and pushed her plate aside. Do you want me to call the bank? Helena asked. Margaret shook her head. Not yet. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, the magnolia tree swayed gently in the breeze. Somewhere, a dog barked down the street. A normal morning. A perfect cover for the kind of betrayal that happened not in blows, but in paperwork. No, she said, her voice clear. Let's wait. I want to see how far they think they can go. Helena nodded, folding the folder shut with a crisp snap. You let me know when. Margaret turned from the window, her eyes sharp. I will. The dining room glowed softly under the antique chandelier, dimmed just enough to make the crystal stemware shimmer. The long mahogany table, freshly polished, held a familiar warmth, though it had sat mostly unused since William's last birthday. Tonight, it was dressed in memory. Helena had gone above and beyond. Roasted duck with rosemary glaze, potatoes layered in cream and thyme, steamed haricots verts, and the Bordeaux William used to open for holidays, the one with the wax seal and the quiet bite. At the center of the table sat Margaret's finest china, white porcelain edged in cobalt blue, gold filigree curling at the rim. It hadn't left the glass cabinet in 5 years. Margaret sat at the head, her hearing aids tuned low, a blank notepad resting beside her plate. Helena had offered to serve, but Margaret insisted, "Let them speak freely tonight. Let's see what tone they take when they think I can't hear the sharpness in their kindness." Peter and Erica arrived precisely at 7. Always punctual, always styled. Peter kissed her cheek absently and complimented the room. Erica air-kissed the air somewhere near her temple and made a humming noise of approval as she drifted around the space. "Oh, the china," she breathed. "I always loved this set. They don't make this detailing anymore, not without charging a fortune." Her eyes scanned the table, then paused for just a second too long on the silver carving set. She looked at the china, Margaret thought, like it already belonged to her. They took their seats. Helena moved in and out like a shadow, refilling water, topping off wine, placing plates with silent precision. Dinner began. Peter asked about Margaret's routines, her health, her schedule, the garden. She answered with nods and occasional notes scribbled in her notepad. Nothing too detailed. Let them fill the silence. Erica, meanwhile, complimented the duck and asked, too casually, where the serving dishes were stored. "You know, just in case we ever need to replicate the setup for holidays." Margaret smiled and jotted, "They're labeled in the pantry, first shelf." "Lovely," Erica said, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin she hadn't soiled. "You're so organized." The conversation meandered toward long-term plans. Peter broached the subject gently. "There's no rush, of course, but if there ever comes a time when this place feels too large or too isolating." Erica chimed in, "We'd never want you to feel trapped by history. Houses like this carry so much weight." Margaret reached for her wine and sipped slowly, writing, "Weight isn't always a burden. Sometimes it's the anchor." Peter read it and smiled, tight-lipped. Erica just blinked. Then, while Helena served dessert, almond tort with orange zest, William's favorite, Erica leaned toward Peter and whispered, just low enough for someone with hearing loss to miss, "Maybe we'll finally get the music room back. I could turn it into a Pilates studio." Peter didn't laugh, but he didn't correct her either. Margaret heard every word. She tapped her pen twice on the notepad, enough to signal her next note. She smiled as she wrote, then passed it across the table. "So glad you could both join me. It's nice to see you relax here." Erica nodded and Peter raised his glass. "To family," he said. Margaret clinked her glass gently and returned the smile. Her face was composed, her movements graceful. Let them drink. Let them celebrate the future they thought they were already dividing. She would serve them patience, and soon, justice. The morning air was crisp, the kind that made the Charleston pines look sharper through the study's bay windows. Margaret sat at William's old writing desk, her fingers folded neatly in her lap. A cup of untouched tea steamed beside her, steeping into silence. Across from her sat Gerald Cho, lean, measured, always in a pressed gray suit no matter the season. He had been William's estate lawyer for nearly 30 years. Now he was hers alone. Gerald adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the paperwork she had laid out on the desk. Her latest bank statements, copies of suspicious invoices, a photo Helena had taken of a blank contractor truck parked near the driveway one morning. No logo, no workers, just idling. "This isn't just mismanagement," he said finally. "This is coordinated misappropriation, likely both of them." Margaret nodded once. "I need it confirmed, quietly. Every account, every transaction tied to Peter's name, his firm, his shell companies, if any exist. Cross-reference the estate accounts with my household budget. Start with the dates I've flagged." Gerald gave a small nod, the kind lawyers use when they're impressed but won't say it aloud. "That's a serious request." "So is stealing from your mother," Margaret replied, voice even. "I'm not asking for a confrontation. I'm asking for the truth." He didn't argue. He never did when she used that tone, the one William used to call her final rehearsal voice. No crescendo, just precision. "I'll start the forensic audit today," Gerald said, taking the folder and placing it gently into his briefcase. "There's more," Margaret said. She reached into the lower drawer of the desk and retrieved a smaller envelope. Inside was a letter she had drafted in longhand 2 nights prior. The edges of the paper were still sharp from the letter opener. "I want a new will," she said. Gerald's eyebrows lifted. "You already have a multi-tiered trust. The inheritance allocations, the control clauses, all of it needs to change," she interrupted. "Peter is to be removed from every control function. No power of attorney, no oversight of the foundation, no executor status. Erica is to receive nothing, not even the car they've already assumed will be hers." Gerald was quiet for a beat. "And the estate?" Margaret exhaled softly, eyes flicking toward the piano in the corner. "The house, the music library, and the family trust. I want them converted into a scholarship residency for underprivileged students, music only, preferably string instruments." He blinked. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Gerald began taking notes, his pen moving steadily. "We'll need to establish a board, an administrative trustee, a charitable filing." "Do it," she said. Then before he could finish writing, she added, "But don't file it yet." Gerald looked up. "You want to wait?" "Yes." "Why?" Margaret leaned back, eyes level. "Because they're still performing. I want to see how far they go before the curtain falls." There was no malice in her tone, only clarity. Gerald studied her for a moment, then set down his pen. "I'll draft the documents, hold the filings, start the audit. You'll have preliminary findings in a week." She nodded. "That's all I need." As he stood to leave, Gerald paused by the door. "You could have come to me months ago." "I could have," Margaret replied, "but I hadn't heard everything yet." He smiled, just slightly, and left without another word. And Margaret, alone again in the stillness of the study, finally reached for her tea. It had gone cold, but the plan at last was warm. Margaret heard the car doors before the bell. 3 sets, not 2. She was seated in her usual chair in the parlor, the one with the embroidered cushion and the perfect view of the garden. A tray of lemon biscuits rested untouched on the table beside her, the notepad placed precisely at her elbow, pen uncapped. It was part of the performance now. The silence, the stillness, the illusion. The doorbell rang, and Helena opened it with the same calm grace she'd practiced for years. Margaret heard the voices clearly from across the house. Peter, Erica, and someone new. Margaret didn't stand. She didn't call out. She adjusted the dial on her hearing aids just slightly and waited. "Mother," Peter called out as he stepped inside. "We're just stopping by for a few minutes. Thought we'd bring someone by to get a second opinion." Erica followed, her heels sharper than usual. "This is Marcus Beckett," she announced brightly, her voice bouncing off the hallway tile. "He's one of the top property consultants in Charleston." Margaret turned slowly toward the doorway, offering a mild smile and a small wave. The man behind them, mid-40s, tan blazer, thin portfolio under one arm, stepped into the room and looked directly at her. "Oh," he said quietly, "she's here." "She likes to sit here most mornings," Peter said quickly, his tone practiced. "Sunlight's good for her." Margaret kept her expression serene. Erica gave a little shrug. "She doesn't catch much of the conversation, but she likes the company." The developer's gaze flicked toward the notepad and then back to Peter. "Of course." Peter gestured toward the high ceilings. "We're considering some future transitions. Not immediately, of course. But the estate's long-term sustainability is becoming a question. Heating, upkeep, zoning. All things to think about." Marcus nodded, flipping open his portfolio. "You've got great bones here. And the lot size? That's prime. You could subdivide easily. New buyers love modern builds with historical proximity. If you merge parcels with the lot just east, you'd have space for a 3-unit complex. High-end. Private drive." Erica stepped beside him, pointing toward the rear windows. The garden wall marks the back lot line. But if we were to take down the older hedges, it would feel even more open. We could keep the facade, something boutique, and still modernize the back elevation. They were speaking like architects already, as if the history embedded in every crown, molding, and banister had already been appraised and cleared. Peter nodded, thoughtful. She won't need all this much longer. We want to get ahead of the paperwork, smooth transitions, avoid delays. Marcus leaned in. And she's amenable? Peter hesitated. She trusts us. We've been managing her affairs for years now. Margaret watched them all without blinking. Her notepad stayed blank. Her pen didn't move. She crossed her hands neatly in her lap and tilted her head just slightly, enough to look curious, not present. She seems very serene, Marcus observed. She's always been elegant, Erica replied, even when she doesn't quite follow anymore. They walked him through the rest of the house. She listened as their voices floated back from the hallway, discussions of square footage, salvage value, and market readiness. Marcus never once addressed her directly. That was their final mistake. When they left, Peter kissed her on the cheek. Erica patted her shoulder like a well-behaved pet, and Margaret, still seated, still silent, waited until the door closed. Then she reached for her pen and began to write. Margaret chose the 2003 Bordeaux, the one William had insisted on saving for a special conversation. She pulled it from the cellar herself that morning, brushing off the wax seal with a cotton handkerchief. The house had been quiet all week, the kind of quiet that made each tick of the grandfather clock feel like punctuation. She told Helena to set the table in the formal parlor. Just 3 places. Linen napkins folded into lilies, crystal glasses, the silver cutlery Erica had once complimented with just enough greed in her voice to make it stick. At exactly 6 p.m. the bell rang. Peter arrived in a navy jacket, crisp as always. Erica wore emerald, sharp-shouldered, flawlessly tailored, a bit too bright for a wine tasting at his mother's house. Her earrings caught the light like a dare. "Mother," Peter greeted, pressing a perfunctory kiss to her cheek. "This is lovely." "Such a treat," Erica added, eyeing the wine bottle as she passed. Margaret gestured them to their seats with a serene smile and sat at the head of the table, her notepad placed beside her plate, a prop in a performance they still believed in. Helena served roasted figs with goat cheese and a drizzle of honey. Margaret poured the wine herself. She didn't say a word. They talked, or rather Peter and Erica did, about the market, about shifting timelines, about easing the burden of ownership. Peter brought out a folder midway through the second glass, a casual gesture, as if it had been forgotten, not planned. "We had these drawn up," he said smoothly. "Just some draft outlines, clean transfers, no pressure." Erica chimed in. "Everything would remain under your name for now, just the technical pieces in motion. It'll simplify taxes, preserve the legacy, you know." Margaret lifted her wine glass and took a slow sip. Then she placed it gently back on the table. She looked at Peter, then Erica. And for the first time in 12 years, she spoke. "I'd like to know why you're so eager to sell what isn't yours." Erica's fingers slipped. The wine glass tumbled from her hand, striking the edge of her plate before shattering across the table. Red pooled into the tablecloth like a spreading blush of shame. Peter went pale. His jaw slackened. "You..." Margaret didn't blink. Peter's voice dropped to a whisper. You can hear?" She nodded once. "I've been able to hear everything for some time now." Erica's lips parted, but no sound came. She looked down at the broken glass, then up at Margaret, like someone realizing the painting on the wall had eyes. Margaret leaned back, hands resting on the table. "The conversations, the plans, the developer you paraded through my home, the fake invoices, the forged signatures, the jokes." She turned to Erica. "Especially yours." No one moved. The chandelier above them flickered faintly, as if even the electricity had held its breath. Peter opened his mouth, but the apology never came. Just silence. His eyes dropped to the folder he'd so confidently laid between them. Margaret picked up her napkin, dabbed the corner of her mouth, and laid it carefully beside her plate. Then she stood. "There's more," she said. "But I thought you deserved to hear the first part, the way I did." Erica bent down to collect the shards of glass, but Helena entered before she could. Expression unreadable, broom already in hand. Margaret didn't look at either of them as she walked out of the room. She didn't need to. The illusion had shattered, and the next course was already waiting. The wine had barely dried on the linen when Helena entered the parlor again, this time not to clear the plates, but to open the front door. Margaret stood in the center of the room, one hand resting on the edge of the grand piano, the other tucked calmly at her side. She didn't turn when she heard the familiar footsteps. She didn't need to. "Evening, Margaret," came Gerald Cho's steady voice. Peter and Erica looked up in unison. Peter blinked, visibly thrown. Erica's jaw tensed as Gerald stepped fully into view, briefcase in hand. "Gerald," Peter said, confused. "What are you—" Margaret finally spoke, her tone quiet but unflinching. "Sit down." It wasn't a suggestion. Peter obeyed. Erica hesitated before following, perching on the edge of her chair like it might burn her. Gerald set the briefcase on the coffee table and opened it without a word. He removed a folder, thick, tabbed, methodically organized. Margaret didn't look at them when she spoke next. "For the past 3 months, I've had every estate account audited, every trust, every transaction with my name on it." She turned to Peter. Her voice was still calm. "You funneled $900,000 from restricted accounts through fake invoices and shell maintenance companies. You forged my signature on 3 authorizations. You labeled a financial withdrawal as an accessibility upgrade." Peter's mouth opened, but she raised her hand, once, and he stopped. Erica crossed her arms. "You're misunderstanding." "No," Margaret interrupted, finally turning to face her. "I've misunderstood nothing. I heard you, both of you, in this room, in the hallway, on the phone, in the garden." She turned to Gerald. "Show them." He placed the new will on the table between them, flipping it open with quiet finality. "This," he said, "is the revised estate plan, prepared under Mrs. Ellison's instruction, filed and notarized as of this morning." Peter's voice cracked. "Wait, filed?" Gerald didn't flinch. "Filed, witnessed, executed." Margaret folded her hands. "All control clauses have been revoked. Peter, you are removed from all trust management and medical directives. Erica, you are not a beneficiary of any kind." Erica stood suddenly. "This is a mistake. We were protecting your legacy." Margaret looked at her, not with anger, but with something colder. Precision. "You used my silence to plan your inheritance," she said. "Now listen to mine." She gestured toward the will. "My estate, including this home, will be converted into a scholarship residency for young musicians. The trust funds will support low-income students who can't afford classical instruction. The house will become a space for sound again, not for silence, not for schemes." Peter leaned forward, eyes desperate now. "Mother, please. This is going too far." She looked at him, not cruelly, but without flinching. "You stopped being my son when I became a ledger line on your balance sheet." His voice faltered. "I didn't mean to, but you did," she said. "Every moment you meant to." Erica's face had gone pale, her fingers curling around the armrest. "We can fix this." Margaret shook her head. "Number, you'll leave now, and you'll take your silence with you." She turned to Helena, who had been standing in the doorway, watching like a sentinel. "Show them out." Peter stood but didn't speak. He looked once at his mother, eyes searching for softness. There wasn't any left. Erica stormed ahead, heels clicking like exclamation points. The front door closed behind them with no ceremony. Margaret turned back to Gerald. "Keep a copy for the conservatory files," she said softly. "And thank you." Gerald gave a nod, then quietly left. Margaret sat down at the piano bench, and for the first time in years, she rested her fingers on the keys. The morning after the confrontation, the house felt different. Not empty, cleansed. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains in the music room, landing softly on the polished wood of the grand piano. Margaret sat alone, her fingers tracing the edges of a manila envelope, the final copy of the audit Gerald had prepared. Neatly bound, no emotion in its pages, just figures, names, dates, truth in black and white. She placed the envelope gently on the entryway table where the mail usually went, not hidden, not confrontational, just waiting, like she had been for the last year. The doorbell rang precisely at 11. Helena answered it wordlessly, stepping aside as Peter and Erica walked in with expressions that didn't match. Peter looked worn, his posture slumped, his movements unsure, like a man who had run out of words before realizing none of them had ever mattered. Erica, in contrast, was tense, eyes darting, lips pressed into a determined line, dressed sharply again, as though dignity could be reclaimed with tailoring. Margaret stood at the base of the staircase, calm and centered, arms folded lightly in front of her. "Gerald will be here shortly," she said, voice clear and steady. "But we won't need long." They followed her into the parlor where 3 chairs were set. Margaret didn't offer tea. She didn't sit. She simply remained standing, letting the weight of the silence press around them. Peter cleared his throat. "We talked. Last night. We wanted to say—" "No," Margaret interrupted. "You've said enough, behind my back, in this room, in your calls, and in the way you watched this house like a harvest you thought was yours to collect." Peter looked down. Erica bristled. Margaret turned to Helena, who had appeared silently at her side with a sealed document in hand. "Is that—" Peter started. "It is," Margaret said. "The revised will, effective today, filed, witnessed, final." Helena placed it on the table beside the audit copy and stepped back. Peter took a small step forward. "Mother, please. You don't have to—" "I do," she said, eyes locked on his. "Because you already did." Erica scoffed lightly, her voice trembling around its edges. "And what do we walk away with? After everything we—" "A copy of the audit," Margaret said coolly, "and the knowledge that I gave you every chance to choose family over fortune. You failed." She walked to the piano and rested her hand on its lid. "This house," she said, "will become a residency for young musicians. The trust will fund their study, their lodging, their instruments. This home was built with sound. I will not let it die in silence." Peter said nothing, not a word. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. Margaret turned her back to them and nodded to Helena. "Let them go," she said. "They've taken enough." Helena didn't hesitate. She opened the door and waited. Peter turned numb. Erica hesitated for a breath, as if she might protest, plead, rage, but she didn't. She simply walked out, one heel clicking against the floor, then the other. The door closed behind them. No goodbye, no final attempt. Just the weight of what was lost, and not just the money. Margaret exhaled slowly. "You thought I was a quiet old woman," she whispered, walking back to her seat. "I was just waiting for the right note." Then she sat down at the piano, eyes closed, fingers poised, and somewhere between the hush of betrayal and the hush of healing, she began to play. The days that followed were quiet, but not the kind Margaret had come to resent. This silence was clean, chosen, a kind of hush that hummed with possibility. The weight in the walls had lifted. The house breathed again. For the first time in years, Margaret opened the doors to the music room. She stood at its threshold one early morning, barefoot, tea in hand, and simply looked in. The polished piano, untouched since William's memorial, gleamed faintly under the shifting light from the lace-curtained windows. The floorboards creaked when she stepped inside, not from age, from welcome. She slid the bench back, slow and careful, and sat down. Her fingers hovered over the keys like old friends reintroduced after a long silence. She didn't force it. She didn't need to prove anything. She played one note, then another. The room didn't shudder. It listened. She moved from note to note, hesitant at first, then smoother. following the melody of a lullaby she once played for Peter as a baby. Her hands remembered what her body had forgotten. By the second chorus, she was no longer thinking. She was remembering. She played for hours that day, stopping only when Helena appeared at the door with a cup of tea and a small, proud smile. "You're playing again," she said softly. Margaret turned on the bench and met her eyes. "I am." They didn't say more than that. They didn't need to. Later that week, Margaret reached out to the local music conservatory, the same one she and William had once sponsored for outreach programs. She asked if they had students in need of extra instruction, private lessons, space to rehearse. The answer came within a day. By the following Tuesday, 3 young musicians stood nervously at her front door, 2 girls with battered violin cases and 1 boy with a cello nearly taller than himself. They looked around the Ellison home with wide eyes, reverent and curious. "This place has an echo," one of the girls whispered, "like it's already singing." Margaret smiled and led them to the music room. She didn't correct them. They weren't wrong. Lessons began simply: scales, posture, breath. But the moment their bows touched the strings, something clicked, not just in the music but in the house itself. Margaret could feel it in the walls. This place had been waiting too. Every afternoon they returned. They practiced. They laughed. They stumbled. They improved. They filled the rooms with motion and sound and the kind of joy that didn't apologize for being loud. Sometimes, Margaret just sat in the hallway and listened. One evening, after the students had left and the sun had settled beyond the trees, Helena brought in a tray with tea and 2 slices of lemon cake. "They're good," she said, setting the tray down. "You're making something here." Margaret nodded, folding her hands over her cup. "So are they." They sat on the settee by the window, warm tea in their hands, the soft hum of the wind brushing against the curtains. The piano stood still now, but not silent. It had said what it needed to. Tomorrow the students would return. Tomorrow the house would breathe again. Helena looked at Margaret with quiet affection. "You seem lighter," she said. Margaret smiled, a slow curve of understanding and peace. "The silence I chose," she said gently, "was better than the noise I left behind." They clinked their cups once, softly, and the music, even in its pause, lingered. It was a quiet Sunday. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and lemon oil, and the late morning sun painted soft rectangles of light on the tile. Margaret was seated in the breakfast nook, wearing the cardigan Helena had knit her 2 winters ago, the one with the deep pockets and small wooden buttons. The kettle was just beginning to sing when Helena stepped in from the porch with the folded newspaper tucked under one arm. She placed it beside the tea tray without comment. Just the Charleston Gazette, like always. Only this time, the top corner was creased. A gentle signal, a soft nudge. Margaret raised an eyebrow, then unfolded the paper. It was a community section story, nestled between an op-ed about park funding and a piece on an upcoming arts festival. The headline was modest: "Local music program revives hope for underserved youth." Beneath it, a photo. A group of middle schoolers in mismatched uniforms, seated in folding chairs with violins and cellos balanced awkwardly in their laps. And in the middle, slightly crouched beside them, was Peter. He looked different. Not undone or broken, just stripped back. His usual blazer had been traded for a plain sweater. No tie, no shine in his shoes. His posture wasn't commanding. It was quiet, almost unsure. He held a cello between his knees like something familiar and slightly heavy. Margaret's eyes skimmed the article. The music program was new, launched in partnership with a struggling public school in Dorchester. Volunteer-led, grant-funded, run by a rotating staff of local musicians and community members. Peter's name appeared only once, 3 paragraphs in. One volunteer, Peter Ellison, a former private sector finance executive, now offers weekly cello instruction. "Music gave me structure when I needed it most," he said. "I want to pass that on." That was it. No mention of lineage, no reference to the Ellison estate. No hint of the woman who had given him that first cello at age 7, who had tuned its strings every week for a year until he could do it himself. Margaret read the quote again. Helena set the tea down beside her. "He's trying," she said softly. Margaret didn't respond right away. Her fingers brushed the edge of the paper, trailing over the photograph like she was checking for warmth. "He looks like William did," she said finally. "Not in the face, in the eyes. That quiet." Helena nodded. "Consequences are better teachers than we are." Margaret smiled faintly, not out of vindication, but out of recognition. Some lessons had to be lived. Some debts had to be felt, not forgiven. She folded the newspaper neatly and set it aside. "I don't need him to come back," she said. "Not here, not to me. But I hope he stays with those children." "He might," Helena said. "It looked real." Margaret sipped her tea. The music room was silent behind them, but not empty. The piano waited. So did the next student, and the next song. Peter had found a version of redemption, not through apology, but through effort. And that, Margaret thought, might be enough. She looked out the window where the garden stirred in the breeze and whispered more to herself than to anyone else. Sometimes consequences teach better than parents can. Helena smiled and passed her the lemon biscuits, and neither of them mentioned the article again. The wind moved gently through the garden, stirring the tall hydrangeas and sending shadows swaying across the stone path. The morning was quiet, not heavy, not waiting, just there, fully present. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask anything from you, but still gives you everything. Margaret stepped out onto the back terrace with a fresh cup of tea in hand. She didn't wear shoes. She liked the feel of the warm flagstone beneath her feet, the grounding of it, the honesty. No performances out here, no carefully folded linens, just the garden and the wind and the moment. She walked slowly, the way one walks when there's no one left to impress and nowhere left to rush. The magnolia tree swayed gently above her, its leaves whispering a language older than apology. She stopped at the edge of the rose beds, the same ones William used to prune with obsessive care. The blooms were unruly now, a little wild around the edges. She liked them that way, unpolished, alive. Margaret took a sip of her tea and looked out over her yard. Still hers, even now that the will had been filed, the keys had been metaphorically passed on. The house would become a school. Yes, a home for music and noise and second chances. But for now, for this one quiet stretch of morning, it was just hers again. She thought about Peter. She hadn't heard from him since the article. No emails, no calls, no letters. Just that single photograph of him crouched beside a group of children, bow in hand, sleeves rolled up, shoulders down, not poised, present. Maybe that was enough. Maybe he was enough, finally, without the weight of her name or the shape of her fortune beneath his feet. "I don't know who he'll become now," she whispered into the wind. "But at least I'm not in his way anymore. And he's not in mine." The words didn't sting. They didn't soothe. They just settled. She closed her eyes. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past her cheek like an old friend returning without explanation. She didn't open her eyes right away. She didn't need to. She heard the rustle of leaves, the soft clatter of a squirrel darting across the wooden fence, the distant echo of a cello, or maybe she imagined it, from somewhere down the block, or from within. And beneath all of that, she heard the smallest sound, the breath of the earth turning, the rhythm of things continuing, the beat between endings and beginnings. She smiled. Maybe Peter had finally started listening. Maybe she had too. Not to each other necessarily, but to something deeper, something slower, something earned. She turned from the garden path and began walking back toward the house, her fingers warm around the teacup, her spine tall, her shoulders light. Behind her, the roses moved in the wind. Ahead of her, the front door waited, and behind it, a lesson plan rested on the piano for her afternoon students. She didn't rush. She simply walked, one step, then another, and then she listened, really listened, and for the first time in a long, long while, it was enough.